Reprise du débat, resuming debate. The honourable member for Scarborough-Agincourt.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I wish to note at this time that I will be splitting my time with my friend from Surrey Newton. Mr. Speaker, it is a pleasure to rise today to speak on the government's plan to repeal the unfair provisions found under the Citizenship Act that were passed in the previous Parliament under Bill C-24 that allowed for the revocation of dual or multiple nationals Canadian citizenship on national interest grounds. Once again, our government is delivering on our commitments that we promised Canadians during last year's federal election. From my perspective, Bill C-24 is not only a bill that personally affects the lives of many of my constituents, it also affects many Canadians across this country. And I note that in the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizens speech, he basically articulated two broad principles that governed the intent behind Bill C-6. He enunciated that first and foremost, and this was something that we had heard throughout the campaign, was the concept of a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, and that we found offensive the notion of dual class, or two different types of classes of Canadian citizens. The second concept that was articulated by the minister was with respect to making changes or peeling back the changes that were found in Bill C-24 that imposed new barriers on welcoming Canadians to this country and becoming citizens, and that there were a series of provisions, mainly 4 provisions within Bill C-6 that attempts to bring back a much more welcoming atmosphere to becoming a Canadian citizen. And I think those are very important principles. But I actually want to focus on 2 different principles. And I want to note, first of all, I really appreciated the speech coming from my friend from the New Democratic Party, the member for Vancouver East, who I thought articulated in very clear terms reasons why her particular party would be supporting the provisions of Bill C-6. And I think she also put forth some legitimate criticisms that she found that we did not necessarily go far enough in Bill C-6. And I take the point that the minister raised, that this government, and this is a reflection of this particular government, that we remain open to reasonable changes. And that, for example, some of the issues that she articulated would be something that this government would definitely entertain. And I want to get to those 2 broad principles that I want to articulate in the short time that I have to talk about Bill C-6 that I felt were particularly offensive under Bill C-24. The first concept that I wanted to advance, which was, I think, a central theme that had been articulated by the previous government, and in particular by the former Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Chris Alexander, was the concept that citizenship was a privilege as opposed to a right. And for me, fundamentally, I have a very severe disagreement with the former minister's particular position on this substantive theme. From my perspective, the whole concept, in the way Minister Alexander had framed it, the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, was in terms of somehow that citizenship was somehow a privilege. And from my perspective, once it is conferred, it attaches rights. You have obligations and responsibilities that come with citizenship, but it confers rights that are protected, as my friend from Vancouver East noted, specifically in the Charter. And so, from my perspective, once it is legitimately acquired, the concept of citizenship, it should not be and capriciously taken away. And that gets me to the second concept that I wanted to raise. And again, I note that my friends in the New Democratic Party touched upon this particular theme, both in the comments from my friend from Vancouver East, as well as from the question from the finance critic for the NDP. And that is the concept of the encroachment of executive power and the lack of procedural due process that was found under Bill C-24. And again, this was very much a concept that I feel fundamentally is something that I deeply oppose. And I take the comments that my friend from Vancouver East noted, that she remains to be concerned that there needs to be a judicial process, procedural due process whenever citizenship is stripped away. And I think this government would be amenable to those kinds of amendments to this particular bill. But it was specifically, in the previous government's perspective, the ability to grant the minister the arbitrary right to decide who gets to keep their citizenship and who doesn't, was what I found particularly odious. And it was particularly odious because it could be done capriciously and without any sort of procedural due process. There is no capacity to appeal. There is no capacity to bring new facts to the table. Now, I know what the Conservative Party is ultimately going to say. We're only stripping citizenship from convicted terrorists. But as we've already heard in the debate in this House, both from the minister and both from my friends in the opposition, that at the end of the day, that once you're convicted of a particular crime, you should serve your time. And that is ultimately the ultimate sanction. And stripping citizenship to certain classes of individuals, from my perspective, is not fundamentally appropriate. And from my perspective, more importantly, much more importantly, it undermines the whole concept of the fundamental principle of rule of law, where we treat all citizens equally. And I note that concept was very well articulated earlier, and I want to reinforce that particular principle in my comments today. So these are really the fundamental issues for myself in terms of why I will be supporting Bill C-6, in addition to the principles that were enunciated by the minister. And this is very much, from my sense, very much about what it means to be Canadian, what it ultimately means to create conditions where we have, and as noted in the opening comments of the minister, a welcoming society, a society that values people from coming from around the world. And I'll even acknowledge my friend from Calgary Nose Hill articulated the same principles. What I don't agree with is, for example, my friend, for example, from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, about somehow that this is an elevation of values. It is a values debate. This is very much a values debate. But the value that we are attaching, okay, is to the protection of fundamental principles, principles that are found in the Charter, principles of rule of law, principles of equality. Those are fundamental. That's why we're here in this place. And if we can't protect those for the people that we find most offensive in our society, then why are we here? Why are we here? That, for me, is the core of the debate and why Bill C-6 must be supported. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires?